So how did psychology make the leap from being a field of interesting ideas to a genuine, hard science? Well, it all comes down to one incredibly powerful concept: measurement. Today, we're going to dig into the very foundation of how we actually quantify the human mind.
But that kicks off a question that sounds, well, kind of impossible, right? How in the world do you put a number on something like happiness or a thought or even a personality trait? This is the central puzzle for a field called psychometrics, which literally means the science of measuring the mind. And the solution, believe it or not, starts with getting a really clear definition of what measurement even is.
Exactly. To measure what we can't see, we first have to agree on what measurement means when we're talking about psychology. And here's a spoiler. It's not quite as simple as just using a ruler.
Okay, I know, that sounds super academic and formal. But the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. All it's saying is that measurement is a consistent, reliable system for turning qualities into quantities, basically turning feelings into figures. It's about creating a clear set of rules so that a number, like your score on a test, is a true representation of an internal state, like anxiety. Let's break this down even more. For any kind of measurement, you've really got four key parts. First up, you have the objects. That's just who or what you're measuring. In this case, it's students. Then you have the attributes. That's the specific quality you care about, like their memory. After that, you've got the numbers, which are, the actual scores you assign. And finally, and this is the most important part, you have the rules. The rules are the system that connects the thing you're measuring to the number you assign. So a simple rule might be, the more answers you get right, the higher your score. This basic framework is the engine that drives all psychological measurement. So with that foundation set, we can finally dive into the 5 pillars that hold up the entire field. The first one, and you could argue it's the most crucial, is objectivity. This is the absolute bedrock of scientific credibility.
What objectivity really means is that we create a standardized procedure that anyone can follow and get the same results. It's about removing personal feelings, hunches, and guesswork from the equation. Everybody is playing by the same rules, which means our observations are consistent and verifiable, no matter who is doing the measuring.
And the payoff for this is huge. It means other scientists can check your work and ideally get the same result, which, as you know, is the cornerstone of the whole scientific method. It stops us from having pointless arguments about what was observed and lets us focus on what those observations actually mean. Without objectivity, you couldn't really test any psychological theories at all. This right here is the line in the sand. On one side, you just have a bunch of interesting but untestable ideas. On the other side, you have a real science where theories can be put to the test, supported, or even proven wrong. Objectivity is what lets us cross that line. Okay, so once your method is objective, the next pillar is to fully embrace the power of numbers. This is our second pillar, quantification, and this is where the real analytical magic starts to happen. Just look at the difference here. A personal judgment like, she seems less anxious. I mean, what does that even mean? How much less? Compared to yesterday? It's vague. But a quantifiable finding, her anxiety score dropped 20 points. Now that is specific. It's clear, it's meaningful. This is the power of turning words into data.
Using numbers lets us see much finer, more subtle changes that we'd totally miss if we were just using simple descriptions. But even more importantly, it unlocks the entire world of mathematics and statistics. We can suddenly start calculating averages, finding correlations, and using all these powerful analytical tools to find hidden patterns in human behavior that would otherwise be completely invisible.
So at the end of the day, quantification is what gives psychology its analytical teeth. It's what allows us to move beyond just observing things and into the world of sophisticated, data-driven science.
So that brings us to our third pillar, which is all about communication. Because once you have objective, quantifiable data, you've got to have a way to share it so that everyone, everywhere, knows exactly what you're talking about. And this is where standardization is absolutely key. When we use a standardized test for, say, anxiety, we can be pretty confident that a score of 50 means the same thing in a study coming out of Tokyo as it does in one from Toronto. Everybody is literally speaking the same scientific language. And this is a game changer. It slashes ambiguity and means we can confidently compare the results from totally different studies. We can see if findings hold up, and we can actually build on each other's work. Science suddenly becomes this massive, cumulative, global effort, instead of just a bunch of isolated projects that can't talk to each other. It's kind of like building with Legos. If everyone has their own unique, incompatible set of blocks, you can't build anything together. Standardization makes sure everyone is using the same bricks, so the entire scientific community can build this incredible tower of knowledge together.
All right, we're on to our final two pillars, and they kind of work together as a team. One is about the practical side of actually doing science, and the other is about its ultimate purpose.
Pillar number 4 is economy. Let's just be practical for a second. Doing research costs a lot of time and a lot of money. But once a really good, reliable test is developed, it can be given to thousands of people super quickly and efficiently. Just compare that to trying to conduct thousands of long, one-on-one, subjective interviews. There's really no contest.
So in short, good measurement is efficient. It lets us get more science done with fewer resources, which is absolutely crucial for tackling the biggest questions of all.
And that efficiency leads us right to our 5th and final and maybe the most profound pillar, scientific generalization. This is the ultimate goal. This is the whole point. We don't just want to understand one person's behavior. We want to use data from thousands of specific events to discover general principles, the universal laws of how the human mind actually works.
This is the end game. Measurement is the incredible tool that lets us zoom out from a single data point to see the massive, overarching patterns that connect all of us. It's how we find the hidden order inside of all our beautiful human complexity. So we've looked at all the pieces one by one. Now let's put them all together and take a look at the big picture they create.
It all comes down to these 5 absolutely essential principles. You've got objectivity, quantification, communication, economy, and finally, generalization. Put them all together, and these 5 pillars create the solid foundation that lifts psychology up and makes it a powerful, progressive science. They give us the tools we need to finally and reliably measure the unseen.
And that leaves us all with a pretty fascinating question, doesn't it? Now that we have these incredible tools to quantify the human experience, what are the most important mysteries we should be pointing them at next? Thanks for tuning in.
You've probably taken one of those online personality quizzes, right? Or maybe an aptitude test for a job. But have you ever stopped and wondered, how do they actually work? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain on the hardcore science that turns a simple list of questions into a powerful tool for measuring the human mind. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to tackle the big problem, the measurement challenge itself. Then, we'll look at the actual blueprint for a test, figure out how we make sure it's accurate and consistent, write the user manual, and finally, learn how to read the results. By the end, you'll see why all this precision really, really matters.
All right, let's dive right into the central puzzle. I mean, it's pretty easy to measure your height, right? You just grab a measuring tape. Or your weight, you step on a scale. But how in the world do you put a number on something you can't see or touch, like someone's intelligence or their personality? This is the fundamental challenge that the entire field of psychometrics is built to solve.
So what's the solution? Well, you have to build a tool, a very carefully designed scientific instrument. But instead of measuring things like volts or kilograms, this instrument is built from the ground up to measure psychological concepts. And we call it, simply, a psychological test. According to the experts, a psychological test is an objective and standardized measure of a sample of behavior. Now, that phrase, sample of behavior, is absolutely key. Look, we can't follow you around for a year to see how extroverted you are, so instead, we take a sample. We ask specific questions like, do you enjoy large parties, to get a representative snapshot of that bigger trait.
And this really gets to the heart of how it all works. A test doesn't have some magic probe that plugs into your brain and measures intelligence. Nope. What it does is measure your performance on carefully structured tasks, like solving puzzles or defining words. From that performance, we then infer the underlying trait. So that score you get, it's an indicator, a clue, not a direct measurement.
Okay, so we have our instrument, but just like any scientific tool, it's totally useless if it isn't calibrated properly. In psychometrics, this all comes down to 2 massive ideas: reliability and validity. First up is reliability. And reliability is all about one word: consistency. Think about a bathroom scale. If you step on, step off, and step back on a minute later, you expect it to show the exact same weight, right? A reliable psychological test does the same thing. It produces stable, consistent scores over time, not just random noise. But just being consistent isn't enough. The test also needs validity, and validity is all about accuracy. Let's go back to that scale. It could reliably tell you that you weigh 10 pounds every single time. Super consistent. But if you actually weigh 150 pounds, it's not a valid measure of your weight, is it?
A valid test is one that actually accurately measures the thing it's supposed to. And this shows the crucial difference perfectly. You can have a test that's incredibly reliable but completely invalid. Imagine a test that claims it measures anxiety but is really just asking you a bunch of hard vocabulary questions. It might give you the same score every time, making it reliable, but it's totally invalid for measuring anxiety. A good test must be both.
Right. So we have a perfectly calibrated instrument. But that's still not enough, because if different people use it in different ways, the results are worthless. This brings us to the test's user manual, the principles of standardization and objectivity.
Standardization is all about creating the exact same experience for every single person who takes the test. That means the conditions are fixed, everyone gets identical instructions, and the whole process is administered in a consistent way. This is so important because it makes sure that any differences in the scores are because of real differences between people, not random changes in the testing situation.
And going hand in hand with standardization is objectivity. This is all about removing any subjective, personal judgment from the scoring. A multiple choice test with a clear answer key is super objective. An essay where two different graders might give totally different scores, not so much. Objectivity makes sure your score doesn't just depend on who happened to be grading it that day.
Okay, so we now have a reliable, valid, standardized, and objective test. It gives us a number. Great, but what does that number actually mean? A raw score, all by itself, is like someone telling you the temperature is 25 without saying if it's Celsius or Fahrenheit. It's totally meaningless without context.
And this is where norms come in to save the day. Norms are basically the collected scores from a huge representative group of people, the norm group, who took the test during its development phase. This group provides the all-important baseline that lets us compare and interpret any individual score.
For example, let's say you take a test and get a score of 115. What does that tell you? Honestly, absolutely nothing. Is 115 high, low, average? Who knows? Without any context, it's just a number floating in space.
But now, watch what happens when we bring in the norms. If we know the average score for the big standardization group was 100, your score of 115 suddenly clicks into place. Boom! We can clearly see you scored above average. Norms are what transform a raw number into a meaningful interpretation.
And finally, there's the simple reality check of practicality. A test can be a scientific marvel, but if it takes 10 hours to do and requires a PhD and a supercomputer to score, it's not very useful in the real world, is it? So test makers are always balancing scientific perfection with practical usability, making sure it's efficient enough for real-world use.
So let's bring all these pieces together. We've looked at all the individual components, but why is all this methodological rigor so incredibly important? What's the big deal?
Well, these 6 principles we've just walked through, objectivity, standardization, reliability, validity, norms, and practicality, they are the essential hallmarks. They are what separate a simple quiz you find online from a scientifically sound psychological instrument.
And the stakes for getting this right are unbelievably high. These test results aren't just academic games. They're used to inform huge, life-altering decisions. We're talking about everything from diagnosing a learning disability in a child, to planning a course of therapy for a patient, to deciding who gets hired for a critical job.
So I want to end by leaving you with this critical question. We know a test can be consistent but inaccurate, reliable but not valid. So what are the profound ethical and practical consequences of using a flawed tool like that to make decisions that will shape someone's entire future? It's a question that shows why the science of measurement isn't just important, it's absolutely essential.
Today, we're not just going to list off a bunch of psychological tests. No, we're going way deeper. We're going to build a professional framework, a way of thinking that helps you pick the perfect assessment tool for whatever you need. Honestly, this is the skill that really separates the pros from the amateurs. So let's get right into it. Okay, so picture this. You've got a candidate, and you need to figure out how good their problem-solving skills are. There are literally thousands of tests out there. How in the world do you choose the right one? I mean, this is a huge decision professionals deal with all the time. If you pick the wrong tool, you're not just wasting time and money, you could end up with totally flawed conclusions, and that's just not ethical, right? The secret isn't knowing every single test. That's impossible. It's about knowing how to classify any test you come across. All right, so here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the basics, then we'll break down how tests are classified. by logistics, what they measure, their purpose, and their scope. And then we'll pull it all together to create a complete test profile. Think of this as our roadmap for building that pro-level decision-making framework. Okay, first up, choosing the right tool. Let's start with the big idea here. I want you to think of these classifications as a set of different lenses, right? Each one gives you a totally unique view of a test's strengths and weaknesses, helping you size it up with real professional precision. And this right here, this is the core principle. You can't just slap a single label on a test and call it a day. It's the combination of all these different classifications, how it's given, what it's actually measuring, and why you're even using it in the first place that gives you the full story. All right, so first, let's dive into the how. We're talking logistics. These classifications are all about the practical, procedural side of a test. They really dictate how rigorous it is, where you can use it, and ultimately, how you generate and make sense of the results. So with administration, you've got this classic trade-off. On one hand, you have individual tests. These are great because you get so much rich, qualitative data. You're one-on-one, so you can see how the person behaves, build some rapport, maybe even adapt a little. But they're expensive and time-consuming. On the other hand, you've got group tests. These are super efficient, way more economical if you're doing mass testing, like for a big hiring round. You just lose that personal touch. So which one's better? It totally depends on what you're trying to achieve. Okay, now let's talk standardization. This is a really critical difference. Standardized tests, they're kind of the bedrock of scientific assessment, right? They have uniform procedures, established norms, all the stuff that lets us make real, meaningful comparisons between people. But then you have teacher-made tests. They might not have all that psychometric backing, but they offer incredible flexibility that can be tailored exactly to what was taught in a specific classroom. So it's really a story of scientific rigor versus targeted flexibility. And when it comes to scoring, you run into this tension between reliability and richness. Objective tests, think multiple choice, are fantastic. They're fast, super reliable, and you take the examiner's personal bias right out of the equation. But subjective tests, like an essay or a projective test, that's where you can get some really deep, nuanced insights. The catch? You open the door to potential bias and the scoring just isn't as reliable. It's another one of those crucial trade-offs. Okay, so we've covered the how. Now let's switch gears and look at the what. What's the actual stuff the person is interacting with? Is it words, pictures, objects? This is huge because the content of a test directly affects things like accessibility and cultural fairness. This table lays it out perfectly. You've got your verbal tests, which are great for people with strong language skills. Then you have nonverbal tests that use pictures to cut down on language bias, though they still need some instructions. Performance tests, like using blocks, are perfect for kids or people who can't read. They involve actually doing something. And then there's non-language tests, which try to remove language entirely from everyone involved. So think about it for a second. If you need to assess a non-native speaker for a skill that isn't verbal, which of these is going to give you the most accurate and fair result? It really makes you think, doesn't it? And now we get to what is, in my opinion, maybe the most important classification of them all. Why? Why are we even doing this test? The test's ultimate purpose, its main objective, that's what drives everything else, from how it's designed to how it should be used. Aptitude tests are all about looking into the future. They're trying to measure potential. Think about career counseling or college admissions. We use these to try and predict who's most likely to succeed down the road. But, and this is super important to remember, these are just probabilities. They're educated guesses, not crystal balls. Now, achievement tests are the complete opposite. They're not looking forward, they're looking backward. They don't predict your potential, they measure what you've already learned. This is what you'd use to see if, say, a training program at work was actually effective. Personality tests, on the other hand, try to get a handle on an individual's typical traits, their emotional patterns, motivations, how they interact with people. You see these a lot in clinical and counseling settings, and they're incredibly valuable for getting a holistic view of a person. The big thing to keep in mind, though, is that people can distort their answers, whether they mean to or not. And finally, we have clinical tests. These are highly specialized tools. They're designed specifically to help diagnose psychological disorders and plan out treatment. And because of that, their interpretation requires a ton of expertise. These are definitely not tools for amateurs. They should only be used by qualified professionals. All right, our last set of classifications has to do with scope. These two categories really define the boundaries of the test, how it uses time, and how many different things it tries to measure at once. This is a classic one, speed versus power. The question is, what are you trying to measure? Do you want to see the absolute hardest problems someone can solve? That's a power test, and you give them plenty of time. Or do you want to see how fast they can churn through a bunch of relatively easy tasks? That's a speed test. You'd use that for jobs like data entry, where quickness is key. And here we're looking at depth versus breadth. A trait-specific test gives you a really focused, precise, deep dive on one single thing, like mechanical aptitude. An omnibus test is the opposite. It gives you that wide-angle, panoramic view of a bunch of different traits all at once. It's great for getting a broad profile, but you're not going to get as much detail on any one specific area. Okay, so here it is, the aha moment. We've been looking at all these classifications one by one. But the real magic happens when you put them all together. You see, any single test isn't just one of these things. It's defined by a combination of them, all working together. Let's actually build a profile together. Imagine a standard clinical intelligence test. So, let's ask our questions. How's it administered? One-on-one, so it's an individual test. How's it scored? Well, it's usually a mix, so it's both objective and subjective. What's the content? It's got word-based stuff and hands-on tasks, so it's verbal and performance. What's its purpose? It's used for diagnosis and to predictability, so it's both clinical and aptitude. And its scope? It measures a bunch of things and focuses on ability, so it's an omnibus power test. See how that works? We just built a really detailed, multi-layered professional description of that one tool. So, what's the big takeaway here? This whole framework, it isn't just some boring academic exercise. It's an ethical and professional imperative. This is what separates someone who just administers tests from a true assessment professional. It ensures that we use these incredibly powerful tools responsibly and, most importantly, effectively. All right, today we're pulling back the curtain on the architecture of assessment. We're going to look at the incredibly rigorous scientific process that takes a bunch of questions and turns them into a professional measurement tool. So let's kick things off with a big question. What really separates one of those fun online pop quizzes from, say, a clinical diagnostic tool? I mean, what's the difference? Well, it's not just about the questions being harder. The answer is this deep procedural and statistical chasm that's built on a super systematic process. You see, every single well-built test starts not with writing questions, but with a blueprint. Yeah, just like in architecture. This is the absolute foundational planning stage, where the whole purpose, the scope, and the structure of the assessment are meticulously laid out. Okay, so this planning phase, it breaks down into 3 key steps. First, you've got to define your purpose. Let's imagine we're building something called a Postgraduate Research Anxiety Scale, or PGRAS for short. Our purpose? To measure anxiety. And our target group? Master's and PhD students. Simple enough. Second, we specify the content areas. I mean, what kind of anxiety are we talking about? We could break it down into anxiety over literature reviews or data analysis, or the big one, the thesis defense. And finally, we define the behavioral objectives. What are the observable feelings or actions that actually represent this anxiety? Getting this right from the start is absolutely crucial. So once that blueprint is locked in, we can move on to actually forging the raw materials of the test, the items themselves. And this isn't just about brainstorming some questions. It's a really careful process of translating those abstract ideas into concrete, measurable items. Now, here's a key part of the stage. You have to create way more items than you'll actually end up using. For our PGRASs, we probably write dozens and dozens of potential questions for each little content area. This giant initial pool is vital, It ensures you're covering everything, and it gives you enough raw material to work with later on. Because, well, let's just say the statistical refinement phase is pretty ruthless. But before we get to all that heavy statistical analysis, we need a reality check. And that's where pilot testing comes in. You give your draft test to a small group from your target population, a handful of grad students in our case. Are the instructions confusing? Is there a question that's just worded weirdly? Does the whole thing take way too long? This is the practical, common sense step to iron out all the obvious kinks before you invest in the really heavy-duty analysis. And that brings us to what I like to call the item gauntlet. After that pilot test, every single question has to go through a trial by fire. This is a purely data-driven phase where each item has to prove its statistical worth if it wants any chance of making it into the final test. And the heart of this process isn't about guesswork, it's all about calculation. Two metrics are super critical here. There's the difficulty value, which tells you the percentage of people who agree with an item, but then there's the discrimination index. And honestly, the discrimination index is probably the most important metric of all. It tells us whether an item can actually separate people who are high on a trade from those who are low on it. Let's make this real with our PGRS example. Look at this item. I feel overwhelmed by my literature review. It has a really high discrimination index of 0.45. What that means is that students with high overall anxiety are way more likely to agree with this than students with low anxiety. It works. It actually separates them, so we keep it. But now look at this one. I enjoy statistical analysis. Its discrimination index is a pathetic 0.05. It doesn't differentiate between our high and low anxiety groups at all. It's just dead weight. So we discard it. No second thoughts. Okay, so after forging and then ruthlessly refining our items, we get to the final quality control phase. This is where we establish the test psychometric credentials. We have to prove that our new instrument isn't just accurate, but that it's also incredibly consistent. And that brings us to the two pillars of test quality: reliability and validity. Just think of it like a bathroom scale. Reliability means if you step on it 3 times in a row, it gives you the exact same weight each time. It's consistent. Validity means it's actually measuring your weight and not, I don't know, your height. It's accurate. A professional test has to be both. It's non-negotiable. So to dig a little deeper on reliability, if a student takes our PGRAS today and then again in 2 weeks, and we assume their underlying anxiety hasn't really changed, a reliable test is going to produce a very, very similar score. That stability is everything. Without it, the scores are just random noise. And then we have validity. You could argue this is the single most important aspect of any test. This is where we gather all the evidence to prove that our PGRS is truly measuring research anxiety and not some other related thing, like general depression or academic stress. Validity is what gives the final scores their scientific meaning and lets us make interpretations with confidence. Okay, so you've done all the work, you have a final, reliable, and valid test. A student takes it and gets a score of 42. So what does that mean? On its own? Absolutely nothing. A raw score is meaningless without context. To give it that context, we have to give the test to a huge representative sample of our target group to develop what we call norms. So that student's score of 42, for example, is now compared to the distribution of scores from that whole reference group. And if that score happens to fall 1 standard deviation above the average, well, now we know something. We know this student's research anxiety is higher than about 84% of their peers. See, the norms are what translate a meaningless number into a powerful interpretation. And finally, with all that statistical heavy lifting in the rearview mirror, the test is ready to be put together in its final form. But the test itself is really only half the product. The other, equally important half is the documentation that makes sure it's actually used correctly. Right, the test manual. This is the essential rulebook. It has everything a professional would need to know. Exactly how to administer it, how to score it, all the technical data on its reliability and validity, the norm tables for interpretation, and, this is a big one, a clear statement on the test's intended uses. This manual is what ensures the test is used consistently and ethically, which protects the integrity of the whole process. You know, a single test score can literally change a person's life. It can open the door to a new career, lead to a crucial diagnosis, or even sway a legal decision. But what happens when that very tool, the one designed to help, ends up causing harm? That's the huge question at the very heart of psychological testing, and that's what we're going to unpack today. So let's just dive right in. When does a psychological test cross that line? When does it go from being a helpful instrument to a serious ethical liability? And believe me, this isn't just some abstract academic question. For anyone out in the field, a misstep here can have absolutely devastating real-world consequences for the very people we're trying to help. To get to the bottom of that, we're going to look at the entire life cycle of a psychological test, from the moment it's created to the moment it's used. We'll start with the ethical foundation, the bedrock principles. Then we'll explore the 2 pillars everything rests on, the test's ethical construction and its ethical administration. And finally, we'll see how all of that comes together to define what professional integrity really means in this field. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning, the ethical foundation. what really separates a professional psychological test from, some random 10-question quiz you find online? The answer, when you boil it all down, is scientific rigor. This is the key insight from experts like Anastasia and A.K. Singh. A psychological test is a scientific instrument. Seriously, think of it like a high-powered microscope. When it's built right and used correctly, it reveals these incredible, hidden details. But if it's poorly made or used by someone who doesn't know what they're doing, the results aren't just wrong, they are dangerously misleading. So, what are these ethical principles? Well, they're not just friendly suggestions. They are the strict rules of the road for using these powerful tools. They're the guardrails that keep us from veering into misuse, misinterpretation, and ultimately from causing real harm. All right, so let's dig into our first pillar of trust, ethical construction. Long before a test ever reaches a practitioner's hands, it has to be built on a solid foundation of these principles. This is really where trust in the whole process begins. And this slide right here gets to the heart of it. A.K. Singh makes it incredibly clear. Good science is good ethics. Every single part of making a test, from writing the questions to collecting the data for comparison, has to be scientifically sound. A poorly built test isn't just bad, it's unethical, because you're basically baking in flawed and deeply unfair conclusions right from the start. So what does that actually look like? Well, first off, the creators have to be totally transparent about the test's validity. Does it really measure what it claims to? And its reliability. Does it do it consistently? Next, the normative sample, that's the group used to set the baseline scores, has to be diverse and truly represent the people who will actually take the test. Third, the content has to be kept secure. And finally, it absolutely must be fair to people from all kinds of cultural and linguistic backgrounds. These are not optional extras. They are the non-negotiables. And let's just zero in on that security piece for a second, because it's a huge deal. As Anastasia points out, if the test questions leak, the whole thing is basically worthless. And why is that? Because if you already know the questions, the test isn't measuring your aptitude or personality anymore. It's just measuring your memory. It completely loses its power to predict or diagnose anything. And this ties right into fairness. Just think about it. Imagine a verbal reasoning test that uses phrases like a dime a dozen or barking up the wrong tree. Is that test really measuring how well you can reason with words? Or is it just a culture quiz? For someone from a different background, a low score could unfairly tag them as having poor verbal skills when the reality is they just didn't know the idiom. That's not just a bad result. It's a profoundly unethical one. Okay, so let's say we have a well-built test. That's great. But a great tool in the wrong hands can still do a lot of damage. And that brings us to our second pillar, ethical administration. Now, the responsibility shifts from the person who created the tool to the professional who actually uses it. This one is a big deal, and honestly, the experts are unanimous here. Only trained professionals should be using these tests. Anastasia warns that some of the worst, most harmful mistakes happen when unqualified people try to administer and interpret these complex tools. Having the right training isn't just a good idea, it's an absolute ethical requirement. Standardization is all about consistency. It's that simple. To get a reliable result, every single person has to take the test under the exact same conditions. If you give one person a little extra time or a hint on a question, or let them take it in a noisy cafe, well, their score can't be fairly compared to anyone else's. Even a tiny change can make the results completely meaningless. And getting the score is really just the beginning of the process. This is so important. As Anastasia emphasizes, a test score by itself tells you almost nothing. An IQ number, a personality score, it's just one single piece of a much, much larger puzzle. It needs context to be understood correctly and ethically. A truly ethical interpretation looks at the whole person. You take that test score, right, and you combine it with their personal history, their behavior during the test. Were they super nervous, distracted, and any other relevant info you have. A low score on a cognitive test might look alarming on its own, but if you find out that person was totally exhausted from being up all night with a sick kid, well, that changes everything, doesn't it? Now let's quickly touch on test prep. There's a massive difference between ethical preparation, like making sure someone is well-rested and understands the instructions, and unethical coaching on the actual test items. As Anastasia explains, that kind of coaching turns a sophisticated assessment into a glorified memory game. Yeah, it might boost the score, but it makes the test completely useless for predicting anything meaningful in the real world. So let's bring it all home. When you have an ethically built test and it's used in an ethical way by a qualified professional, what does that actually look like? Well, it leads us to the core responsibilities that really define integrity in this field. This is basically the promise we make to every single person who takes a test. Your results, they're going to be kept private. Period. We will do everything in our power to protect you from any kind of distress. We're going to use this information to help and understand you, never ever to just stick a label on you. Your dignity and your rights are always, always the top priority. And in the end, it really all comes down to this balance. The scientific rigor of those two pillars, construction and administration. It isn't just some academic exercise. It exists for one single reason: to protect and uphold the dignity of the person being assessed. That's it. That's the whole point of ethical psychological testing.